Hello Year 4 and welcome to today's English lesson. Today we're going to finish reading George's Marvellous Medicine. Let's have a quick recap of what's happened so far. See if you can follow my story trail all the way from the beginning when Grandma was being really mean to George and really unkind. And then George had an idea, he went through making his marvellous medicine, and then the consequences of that when he gave it to Grandma. We go all the way round. He gave some to the hen, Mr. and Mrs. Cranky came home, and then ended up giving it to lots of farm animals. And then Mr. Cranky wanted to sell the medicine to other farms, so he wanted George to try and make it again. They tried to make the same medicine again, George's Marvellous Medicine number 2, but it went a bit wrong, and they ended up with a chicken with very long legs. Who knows what's going to happen next? Well, I can let you have a sneaky peek because these are the names of the final 3 chapters. We have Marvellous Medicine number 3, Marvellous Medicine number 4, and Goodbye Grandma. Pause the video and make a prediction about what you think is going to happen at the end of the story. Okay, let's find out. This chapter is Marvellous Medicine number 3. Here it is, cried Mr. Killy-Cranky, rushing into the kitchen. 1 carton of flea powder for dogs and 1 tin of brown shoe polish. George poured the flea powder into the giant saucepan. Then he scooped the shoe polish out of its tin and added that as well. Stir it up, George, shouted Mr. Cranky. Give it another boil. We've got it this time, I bet we've got it. After Marvellous Medicine number 3 had been boiled and stirred, George took a cupful of it out into the yard to try it on another chicken. Mr. Cranky ran after him, flapping his arms and hopping with excitement. Come and watch this one, he called out to Mrs. Cranky. Come and watch us turning an ordinary chicken into a lovely great big one that lays eggs as large as footballs. I hope you do better than last time, said Mrs. Cranky, following them out. Come on, chicken, said George, holding out a spoonful of medicine number 3. Good chicken, chick, 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 chick. Have some of this lovely medicine. A magnificent black cockerel with a scarlet comb came stepping over. The cockerel looked at the spoon and it went, peck. Cock-a-doodle-doo, squawked the cockerel, shooting up into the air and coming down again. Watch him now, cried Mr. Cranky. Watch him grow. Any moment he's going to start getting bigger and bigger. Mr. Killy-Cranky, Mrs. Cranky, and little George stood in the yard staring at the black cockerel. The cockerel stood quite still. It looked as though it had a headache. What's happening to its neck? Mrs. Cranky said. It's getting longer, George said. I'll say it's getting longer, Mrs. Cranky said. Mr. Cranky, for once, said nothing. Last time it was the legs, Mrs. Cranky said. Now it's the neck. Who wants a chicken with a long neck? You can't eat a chicken's neck. It was an extraordinary sight. The cockerel's body hadn't grown at all, but the neck was now about 6 feet long. All right, George, Mr. Cranky said. What else have you forgotten? I don't know, George said. Oh, yes, you do, Mr. Cranky said. Come along, boy, think. There's probably just one vital thing missing and you've got to remember it. I put in some engine oil from the garage, George said. Did you have that on your list? Eureka, cried Mr. Cranky. That's the answer. How much did you put in? Half a pint, George said. Mr. Cranky ran to the garage and found another half pint of oil. And some antifreeze, George called after him. I sloshed in a bit of antifreeze. So, medicine number 3 didn't go very well. Let's see how medicine number 4 goes. Do you think they'll get it right this time? Who knows? Back in the kitchen once again, George, with Mr. Cranky watching him anxiously, tipped half a pint of engine oil and some antifreeze into the giant saucepan. Boil it up again, cried Mr. Cranky. Boil it and stir it. George boiled it and stirred it. You'll never get it right, said Mrs. Cranky. Don't forget, you don't just have to have the same things, but you've got to have exactly the same amount of those things. And how can you possibly do that? You keep out of this, cried Mr. Cranky. We're doing fine. We've got it this time. You see if we haven't. This was George's marvellous medicine, number 4. And when it had boiled for a couple of minutes, George once again carried a cupful of it out into the yard. Mr. Cranky ran after him. Mrs. Cranky followed more slowly. You're going to have some mighty queer chickens around here if you go on like this, she said. Dish it out, George, cried Mr. Cranky. Give a spoonful to that one, over there. He pointed to a brown hen. George knelt down and held out the spoon with the new medicine in it. Chick, chick, he said. Try some of this. The brown hen walked over and looked at the spoon. Then it went, peck. Ouch, it said. Then a funny whistling noise came out of its beak. Watch it grow, shouted Mr. Cranky. Don't be too sure, said Mrs. Cranky. Why is it whistling like that? Keep quiet, woman, cried Mr. Cranky. Give it a chance. They stood there staring at the brown hen. It's getting smaller, George said. Look at it, Dad. It's shrinking. And indeed it was. In less than a minute, the hen had shrunk so much it was no bigger than a new hatched chick. It looked ridiculous. So medicine number 4 didn't go right either. And now we're left with just one final chapter, called Goodbye Grandma. Have you worked out what's going to happen to her? Let's find out. Goodbye Grandma. There's still something you've left out, Mr. Cranky said. I can't think what it could be, George said. Give it up, Mrs. Cranky said. Pack it in. You'll never get it right. Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with the spoon in one hand and the cupful of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the 3 people below her and she shouted, What's going on around here? Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough having to sleep in the yard with the rats and mice, but I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs and bacon, no buttered toast. I'm sorry, Mother, Mrs. Cranky said. We've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away. Let George get it, the lazy little brute, Grandma shouted. Just then, the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. Ho ho! She cried. Ha ha! So that's your little game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? You make quite sure you've got a nice cup of morning tea, but you didn't think to bring one to your poor old grandma. I always knew you were a selfish pig. No, Grandma, George said. This isn't... Don't lie to me, boy, the enormous old hag shouted. Pass it up here this minute. No, cried Mrs. Cranky. No, Mother, don't. That's not for you. Now you're against me too, shouted Grandma. My own daughter trying to stop me having my breakfast, trying to starve me out. Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman and he smiled sweetly. Of course it's for you, Grandma, he said. You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot. Don't think I won't, Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge horny hand for the cup. Hand it over, George. No, no, Grandma, George cried out, pulling the cup away. You mustn't. You're not to have it. Give it to me, boy, yelled Grandma. Don't, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's George's marvellous. Everything's George's round here, cried Grandma. George is this, George is that. I'm fed up with it. She snatched the cup out of little George's hand and carried it high up out of reach. Drink it up, Grandma, Mr. Cranky said, grinning hugely. Lovely tea. No, the other two cried. No, no, no! But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. Mother, wailed Mrs. Cranky, you've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine number 4, and look what one tiny spoonful did to that little old brown hen. But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. This is going to be interesting, Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. Now you've done it, cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. You've cooked the old girl's goose. I didn't do anything, Mr. Cranky said. Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it. A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears and whistling as it came. She'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam, Mr. Cranky said. She's going to blow up, Mrs. Cranky wailed. Her boiler's going to burst. Stand clear, Mr. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill it hurt the ears. Call the fire brigade, cried Mrs. Cranky. Call the police! Man the hose pipes! Too late, said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. Grandma, shrieked Mrs. Cranky. Mother, run to the drinking trough and put your head under the water. But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She had started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. Watch this, George, Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. Watch what happens when someone's had 50 spoonfuls instead of 1. Very soon, Grandma was back to normal height. Stop, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's just right. But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got, down and down she went. In another half-minute she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. How do you feel, Mother? Asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression it had always had. Her eyes, no bigger now than little keyholes, were blazing with anger. How do I feel? She yelled. How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant a minute ago and suddenly you're a miserable midget? She's still going, shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. She's still getting smaller. And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and she cried, How do I stop her getting smaller still? You can't, said Mr. Cranky. She's had 50 times the right amount. I must stop her, Mrs. Cranky wailed. I can hardly see her as it is. Catch hold of each end and pull, Mr. Cranky said. But by then, Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still shrinking fast. A moment later, she was no bigger than a pin. Then a pumpkin seed. Then... Where is she? Cried Mrs. Cranky. I've lost her. Hooray, said Mr. Cranky. She's gone. She's disappeared completely, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's what happens to you if you're grumpy and bad-tempered, said Mr. Cranky. Great medicine of yours, George. George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky kept wandering round with a puzzled look on her face, saying, Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you? But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, Oh, well, I suppose it's all for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she? Yes, Mr. Cranky said. She most certainly was. George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief moments, he had touched with the very tips of his fingers the edge of a magic world. And that's the end of the story. Was your prediction right? Mine wasn't. Pause the video and think about what your answers would be to these questions. This will help you with today's task. I think my favourite part of the story was when Grandma started riding round the farm on the giant pony. That really made me laugh. Now that we've finished reading George's Marvellous Medicine, we'd like you to write a book review. But what's the point of a book review? The purpose of a book review is to share opinions about the book. It's to tell people about it if they've never heard of it before, and also to recommend it to people or tell people whether it's any good. Think back to the autumn term when you wrote a book review for the Malamander as part of your homework. For your book review today, you can either write on paper, or if you go into Google Classroom, there's a document for you to write straight into, and it's got helpful questions in each section to help you out. Let's look at the sections before you start. So the first section is about the plot. That means what happens in the story. And the questions we want you to think about are: what happens in the story? Are there any plot twists or any surprises? And what is your favourite part of the story and why? The second box is about the characters. So who are the main characters and who was your favourite character and why they were your favourite? The third section is about your opinion. This is where you share what you thought of the book. So do you like the book? Why or why not? How did the book make you feel? And would you recommend it to a friend? And then at the very bottom, we've got the question, what would you rate the book out of 5? So you need to give it a score out of 5 for how good you thought it was. When you're writing, make sure that you write in full sentences and not just directly answering the questions. So here in the plot section, I've written, George makes a medicine. Yes, the bit with the chicken. That doesn't really make sense to anybody if they can't see the questions. So what we need is something more like this. In the story, George makes a new medicine for his horrible grandma. It has some very impressive effects. One surprising part of the story was when Mr. Cranky got George to feed the medicine to all the farm animals. My favourite part was when Grandma's head went through the roof because I found it really funny. That's more the sort of thing that we're after, so make sure that you write in full sentences. One last thing I will say is please don't give any spoilers away. So in your book review, don't reveal what happens at the end of the story, because otherwise someone might read your review and then they don't need to read the story anymore and it's spoilt for them. I look forward to finding out what you thought of George's Marvellous Medicine. That's it for today. Come back tomorrow for Friday Phonics. Bye.